a zine or a book, or
Mhm.
yeah. And to basically, it sometimes doesn't need to be produced, just to play with the images, how they work with when you put them side by side, and yeah, that's it.
That's it. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's not as simple when you're working on the two books that you have made. And I do
Oh,
want to talk about that. But just for the people who are joining us in, thank you for coming in. And we're joined by Wawi, who's joining us from Manila right now, where it's
hi everyone I'm streaming from Manila, where it's 8:30 in the evening. So,
so dinner time is where we come in, right? Or have you already had your meal?
yeah, I already did.
Okay,
So,
great. So we can go on for a while and not feel guilty about having you hungry on the
no,
other.
no, I have water here. It's okay. Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. Um, Bobby, just to kind of get straight into it, for those who are joining us for the first time, um, hi, this is Anshika. I'm the founder of Offset Projects, where we've been kind of trying to look at reading photo books and reading photographs. Um, we are actually a little experiment out of New Delhi in India, and we focus on reading visuals through the book form, through understanding photography, editing processes, um, just making ourselves aware. And I think the strongest way to do that is to have conversations with each other, with people within the visual arts community, and definitely with people outside of the visual arts community, because sometimes we can get into our own little bubbles and echo chambers as well. And we have an active photo book library that kind of travels wherever it can find a space. And these library sessions, as I like to call them, are accompanied by conversations with authors or artists who are behind the books that they create. Um, and I think owing to the COVID pandemic, we were put into a little bit of a dizzy and wondering what do we do with these conversations and how do we continue to have these conversations. And thankfully, I mean, the virtual world said, go for it. And actually, now we're no longer restricted by geographies and logistics because, Vavi, I can have this conversation with you finally,
Yeah.
though maybe we're not able to be physically present, at the same point of time. But thank you for giving us time today and sharing what I hope will be your process and your questions and your journey with experiments, actually, more than anything. And I mean, to kind of get straight into it, I know that, of course, I mean, with the work, with the lockdown, things are probably changing, but um, there are two books that you have worked on, Dominion and Hunt and Gather. But
Yes.
I wanted to kind of start with you and your interest with photography and how it's expanded from there, uh, largely through a medium of portraiture and performance, And it's been very fascinating. I was actually going through your website today morning, and then I was noticing these the language of the portraiture is slowly becoming more and more complex and more layered, under the same projects. And I was curious to know, for you, what are the possibilities that exist within portraiture?
Mhm. Yeah. If I can just summarize it, because I've been practicing as a contemporary artist, working with photography for almost, I guess, more than 15 years now. So I'm one of those. I jumped from, well, I studied photography,
Mhm.
and when I came out of university, I was working as an editorial photographer, meaning like doing assignments and assignments for magazines mostly. So a lot of
Right.
portrait, like shooting a feature portrait here and there, or fashion story here and there. So it's kind of like kind of sealed my fascination for something about the tableau format, which is about um, trying trying to gather elements on the picture plane for the frame.
Right.
So other people would call it staging. Some other people would call it like interventions or other things. Because to me, it's closer to the idea of collaging
Mm-hmm.
when you decide to put what goes in the frame and what goes
Right.
out of it. So no matter if it's a portrait or if it's a landscape, I somehow weave that in there. This
Mm-hmm.
idea of having a tableau, of having a picture plane that I can introduce elements with as a very present creator. Like as a I'm a photographer. I consider myself as a photographer, but I am also deliberate in what I'm including.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where my interpretation goes. So I'm not just illustrating the things in front of my eyes or in front of my camera, but I'm using these elements to tell a certain angle of things. So looking at these portraits, that these are from my this is from my recent exhibition called Self Portraits in the Tropical Gothic,
Mm-hmm.
which summed up a decade of self portraiture through the use of this format that I'm calling an in-camera collage. So I work with fabric a lot, and I use them as a device to make it more flat. Because photography,
Yeah.
if you're a student of photography, we're always concerned about depth and how to introduce depth, how to have that kind of foreground, mid, and the back. But
Mm-hmm.
for this, I wanted to see if it's possible to also discreetly introduce the flat plane, like as a collage, meaning that it's a deliberate construction of an image. Like it's as
Right.
if you could cut it as paper, but these are in fact these are representations of me, although they're also a documentation of myself. So I kind of um, play with the fact that these self portraits are half fiction, half documentary. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean?
Yeah.
So that's that's when I guess what your idea, what you were saying about performance,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously it's not a snap of a reality. It's not
Right.
a it's not like that. It's very deliberate. So um, yeah. To me, it evolved from a very when I was still using the darkroom. I
Mm-hmm.
was doing a lot of um, pictorial kind of work, like harking back to studio traditions of early photography. That was like
Right.
my interest when I was in college. I was doing a lot of work of staging things. I was into Joel Peter Whitkin, Sarah Moon, that kind
Right.
of world that is it's very metaphysical in a way, but also poetic, and I wanted to I was looking at the medium back then as a very alchemical
Mm-hmm.
medium, because we work with a dark room, something like that. And I was very much into um, just staying in the dark room and very closed up. And as an artist, that you get to see the world more. Then I did more color. Then after that, I abandoned self portraits for a while, because I was already being identified so much with self portraits. And I don't know if it's just because I'm being stubborn. When people were expecting more self portraits from me, during that time I was doing tributes for Frida Kahlo.
Yeah.
Uh, I shifted and did something totally different, which is more landscapes and
Right.
uh, yeah, like interventions in space. And my mentor was telling me, this is no different from your self portraits. This is actually just self portraits, but using Laland
Right.
and using elements found in space. So yeah, I mean, to me, in the wide angle view of things, whether it's a studio or a landscape or walls in a gallery or the book, it's all space that has the potential to be shaped in whatever form, you know,
Yeah.
uh, that I could,
No, and I
you know,
think that's something that I've found very, very interesting. I mean, there's of course a lot of layers and things I wanted to discuss between the portraiture format also, because I mean, like you said, you kept away from the portraiture for a while, but for the
yeah,
time that it was there within tropical Gothic and portraiture, that's seen a re-emergence, in your work right now. But this acute awareness of trying to bring in that two dimensionality to an image, to kind of try to flatten it, and to kind of even it's a very it's kind of a very political stand to talk about the idea of reconstruction and the idea of the interpretative or evidentiary value of photography, right?
yeah,
And I mean, what I find really interesting is that in some ways you're inversing that relationship, because by bringing in that two dimensionality, by bringing in that sense of collage, the image is actually becoming, in some ways, more exactly telling of what you wanted to say,
mhm.
as opposed to the chance interruptions or layers that come into an image when we are talking about the documentary format. And so it's a very, every accidental reading is in some ways a very uh, conscious decision. And I think that's where I was interested. I mean, that's where the conversations of what you want to talk about come in, the layers of symbolism, the layers of metaphors that you want to get into, which I realize come from a lot of influence by literature and by philosophy and by mythology. uh,
Yeah.
they kind of settle into the flatness of that 2D making, you know.
Yeah, very informed, I guess, because also um, artists nowadays, photographers, we're very, very pathetic. Like we are sent to places like for short periods, like doing artist residencies or
Mhm.
covering a thing, and or spending a few years finishing studies here and there. So you kind of like the person ourselves, like the in my experience, like as the one experiencing it all, I also become a collage in that sense of
Right,
experiences and also of cultures that I kind of allowed to amalgamate and
right.
to sort of like blend into their own kind of mutation. So like
Mhm.
looking at this in this shared screen, this La Bruja, all the places she's gone, it looks like a very familiar. It you can trigger, you can see that it's triggering already our database of what we know of this kind of classic
Right.
art
The body language and
and
even,
this one at least like this trope
yeah,
in art in museums. People see this kind of oriental laid out thing,
hmm,
and we see it in the work of Matisse, in the work of those greats, those masters. But it wasn't my intention to kind of bring them back to the fore, but kind of like to tickle that what we already seen before, but read it again because it's also looking at this image is also like the form of the reclining Buddha, you
yeah,
know, like in Thailand you can see like
yeah,
the reclining Buddha. So in a way, in my mind, I was blending the what I've seen in the West for my art education, and then
right.
what I've seen East, and then putting it back in domestic setting where I can totally relate. You know, like when we were when living abroad and we are faced with this reality. Also, as Filipinos, we are almost read as either professionals or somebody who takes care of the house. So it's kind of blended all together, and also fabrics tell a lot of stories. So you can tell, some people who know fabric can tell in my photos that these are coming from different places as well. um yeah, some of them are handmade, some of them are totally like, you know, bought from a store in a mall or something like that,
Right.
or
But
yeah,
also
like
the fabrics, like they have a tapestry to it, they kind of become elements of narration even within within the work, like they have, defined roles. And I mean, whether it's the reconstruction or deconstruction of stereotypes or identities that gets pushed upon us.
Yeah.
But it's often, I mean, I find it interesting because fabric is always an interesting element to play with. It allows a kind of fluidity, it allows a kind of sense of motion, some of which is, I mean, really played with in your work Dominion as well. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to get to that after this. Um, in terms of kind of like the mise en scène that you present in portraiture, or in not just in portraiture but in performative works, and for me, even Dominion is a highly performative work in that sense. And I mean, it's interesting to see what your idea of the constructed image becomes, within that, and what are the narratives that can run through it. And even with Dominion, fabric begins to kind of take on a very central narrative element. It essentially becomes you. I mean, when I read it, I see your performance and your presence in the presence of the fabric. And you have worked with textile a lot in your works as well.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested to see how and what this kind of interdisciplinary conversation goes on in your work. And I mean, do you approach mediums beforehand? Are these mediums that come to you in the process of, creating an image? uh, what influences the different aspects of playing with mediums that comes into play, I mean, that forms your work?
I guess being an artist working with photography, the material could be as wide as the imagination, because we have to put something in front of the camera. We can't use paint to create the images, but we need to work with materials. And to me, it's always something about the initial curiosity, what it can do. Like, for example, fabric, I was looking at it as a very neutral material, but then if I brought it to the volcano and allowed it to drape the volcano, it creates an emotional experience. So when it happens, I feel like my job as a interpreter of things was that it's done. I just have to like take the photo. So it happens almost by instinct. I don't know how to explain that process, but I guess you're right. There's a multidisciplinary thing that synthesizes through experience and personal prism, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But for Dominion, I wanted to capture the volcanic, but not in a way that it's theory, on fire, things that we see in Nat Geo, but to capture the emotional temperature of it. Like, what is it to be faced with that which it has capacity to destroy, and then but then also signals new beginnings, and also makes you realize in which part of the whole field you are in. And
Right.
the fabric was important because to define the space within that lava rock. um, I think we could pull an image.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just got your website on for people. So
Okay, yeah. So if we
should
like,
I go
so
to
for
the next?
example, this series Dominion, it looks very abstract, but everything is volcanic. The recurring Some of the photographs would have a recurring white fabric, and this is exactly the same fabric used for both. The same size. I had it done when I was in situ
Mm-hmm.
in a province where the volcano was, and I had this idea to just bring the fabric to the mountain, to the volcano, as if to the gesture is performative, but those things were not captured by the camera.
Mm-hmm.
It's the end product, it's the end result, it was the one that I photographed for the camera. Because to
Right.
me, I was coming from the time that my studio was destroyed. So everything, the studio was, um, destroyed. And if you look at the first photo, you can see a room and everything is white.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, this one, X after the storm. It looks like it looks like a kind of like a terrain landscape, but it's the fabric covering the debris from that room. So it's trapped underneath all of that fabric. The serenity of the photo and all the whiteness has something inside that is kinetic in the same way as volcanoes would have in itself, something that is at any time about to explode, right? So in this series I was playing with the idea of concealing and revealing,
Mm-hmm.
and also defining by means of erasure. So the white fabric against a very black lava rock garden field. I call it the garden because it feels like it's still a garden.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I could define it. Instead of just taking it just rocks, if I put the fabric in there, I create a relationship with the actual land itself. And I guess people would, when they see like large scale installations involving fabric, of course, Cristo would come to mind. And I think it's important to talk to him right now because he just passed away, and it's globally felt like how he would define spaces with the use of wrapping either man-made or nature, um, or in nature. So it wasn't my intention to do something after Cristo, but I guess everybody who's working with fabric right now has has this to deal with. Like, the first thing that comes to mind, it would always be Cristo. And in my practice, I've worked with some installations that are like exactly like this, like involving bigger spaces and involving um, um, this sort of technique just to lay it out on the actual on the actual landscape. Yeah.
I'm just gonna share a couple of images that you sent me previously from the book as well. And
Okay.
I mean, just to kind of backtrack a little bit on Dominion,
Mhm.
so you actually had your studio burnt down, right? And
Actually, yeah, if you this one was not the fire. This was from typhoon, from a tropical, really strong typhoon. So, those who've known my works, it's highly reactionary to what happens, I guess, in my life that I've abstracted and made into series. So this one is 2011, and this one was after the studio was destroyed by the typhoon. And later on, there was another incident in my studio, which is the fire, which is another work.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
And so a lot of, I mean, so what you chose to create actually was a reaction to what one would otherwise in images see, like you said, in the more traditional documentary format. And I mean, I guess I was curious to kind of also know this relationship that you have growing with land that kind of echoes through pretty much all your works, you know, in some ways, whether it's dealing with migration or whether it's dealing with the idea of destruction and creation.
Mhm.
And of course in hunt and gather, it's, you know, it's kind of a more uh, it's a louder voice in maybe a collectivization
Mhm.
of work. And so I think it would be interesting to talk about like this whole mountain man dust journey that you're constantly
Yeah, yeah,
going
yeah.
through with different, you know, bodies of works of yours as well.
Yeah. I think the the main impetus for me to do that was to I guess follow this curiosity which I don't know anything about, or to challenge myself because I know myself I don't really feel comfortable in this big nature. It's overwhelming. It's physically demanding. It's like I don't even know what I'm going to photograph. It's something that is it's like a flat. It's like a frame that I don't know what to fill, and then I sort of work my way into it as I go along.
Right,
So this one about, so the volcanoes were in 2011,
right,
and it became sort of like an obsession because every place I went that has volcanoes, I would always go, even if I wasn't working on a book or wasn't working on anything. I would just take photographs within volcanic places. And coming from the Philippines, which is an archipelago, um, we are made out of volcanic land, and all lands are actually formed by volcanic activity. So it
right,
was such a revealing thing for me to realize that all of this mass of land that we're all living in has something to do with this destructive or yeah, force.
right.
And then later on, I vacillate into like vast landscapes and into like really kind of um, how do you call it, like making everything small, like in the terrariums, and then going back again to biggest. So it's kind of like an expansion and contraction that
Yeah.
happens in your work, in studio, out of studio. So that somehow, people cannot really keep track of what am I really you know following. But it's actually kind of organic in a way that I approach it, because it's an inhale exhale kind of thing, right? So
Right.
if you don't have a studio, what are you gonna do? So obviously you step out, and then you photograph what's out there. And in that time, so my work, after I lost the studio after the fire, my work was the next work that came after was the marble work, the
Okay.
Medusa
Yeah. I
on
actually
on
I
tropical
want to
marble.
share a little bit of that as well. Just
Yeah.
let me bring up the image. Sorry, 1 second.
Mhm.
But also, I mean, just to kind of quickly go back to Dominion a bit, in the performative aspect of it, there is a lot of myth making that takes place. They're almost like these stories of the land that you're trying to access by the texture of what you see, by the texture of whether it's the firmness. I mean, again, I don't have that image in front of me immediately, but let me just quickly share the screen so I can bring that on. Mhm. Right. So I mean, even when we are talking about the the sense of strength or the sense of quietness that comes through even within these structures, these are all still, I mean, the shapes and the forms that you're looking at, they're almost like creating these creatures, out of nothingness in some ways. uh, I don't know if that was intentional. I hope it was. uh,
Well, yeah, I was very picky because if I had to summarize the amount of photos I took, it would be in the thousands. But I just decided on the last like 20 of it.
mhm,
Um, I guess because I'm into photography, not to show like a narrative like from a beginning, middle, and end, but to showcase an image that has to be read in several ways.
right.
So fewer images, and then if you see the actual prints and
Mhm,
the way they interact as an exhibition, also has a lot to do with how I orchestrate the readings of the photograph. So again, another layer
right.
of performance. Yeah. So I guess I wanted to keep it generous for people who are for the people who are looking at the images.
Mhm,
There's not one way to depict it. There's the certain silence and stillness to the photographs that is what I would call the generosity of the image. And um, for me, that was the hardest to achieve because I could just take hundreds and hundreds of good images, but to achieve that kind of silence within
mhm,
each frame, that's the hardest. It's almost like taking a portrait of a person. Like you could take a
right.
thousand clicks, and then there's just one that has that kind of quality about it that kind of just transcends. And
Right.
the myth factor about it, I guess it's this kind of universal and I would say emotional, because even if the photos end up looking very abstract, very kind of clinical almost, in a
Hmm.
way that it's just in that series kind of very sparse. It also is very emotional because you fill it in with your reading. You fill it in with what it means to you. What does the stars, expanse mean in a series that has to do with volcanoes? Like, there's kind of like a little bit of work that the reader has to do. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
So this, yeah, we're looking at Medusa.
Which is also, I mean, takes a lot from mythology, right?
Yeah, so that
I mean,
one
the
has
entire
has,
world.
has more has more kind of nod to mythology. Although I would say, okay, let's not interpret it per se, because I didn't even read that whole chapter in Medusa again, but I
Okay.
know I know it on the surface well enough.
Right, right. And I mean, it was interesting because also the way that you've chosen to title the works here, um, there's a lot of, I mean, political reading that I would kind of put into the titles and the sequence of what follows from one to the other. Um, and again, within this, the performance of the physical body as opposed to the landscape, which is something that ends up happening more in Dominion, takes precedence. And I mean, do you wanna talk about how the myth making and the performative element came here as opposed to, let's say, a work like Dominion, which eventually found form in a book, which I'm also very curious about, and I wanted to talk to you about
Okay.
dynamics of, the possibilities of performance in a book versus, like you said,
Yeah.
a space in that sense.
Mhm. So this series Medusa, it's really tied to the marble, and the marble as an island itself, because in the Philippines there's an island
Mhm.
called Romblon, and it's made out of marble, like from seabed to the tip of the crests of the landscapes there are made of marble, although because it's tropical it's covered with lush greenery. So that to me was something very interesting, that we have marble here, but it's not in the imagination like we have Carrara marble, right? Like white stones, walls of
Right,
white. um, we are looking at this as tropical marble. And when we see marble, we are talking about the weight of art history, the weight of museums, the weight of, Michelangelo and all of these
right,
um, kind of, yeah, the education that was imposed on us for understanding what this material could be, right? Or so we don't really know how to tell our own story coming from this portion of the earth using marble, because there seems to be like a weird juxtaposition, right? Like
right.
tropical and marble doesn't really blend. But then this is when the Filipino hybridity comes, because out of that comes this kind of baroque
Aesthetic, I think.
yeah, well, that will then later would be part of my interest about the tropical gothic, because we sort of find ways how to absorb it in our culture and then twist it around, although it's something that we totally don't relate with. Like, let's say the island, the people in the island, what they do is all of these like Cleopatra cheslons, like all of these like
Right.
intricate Greek columns, and that has nothing to do with the daily life
Their
of
identity, even. Yeah.
yeah. But then you'll see it in their living rooms and in the goblets that they use for drinking. So it's kind of this third layer that I'm interested in. And going back to the landscape, the difference between this and Dominion is that Dominion was entirely about the land, and this absent human being trying to connect with nature. With with Medusa, there is man, and the mountain. So the mountain, which is the marble, and then the man who shapes this marble, who shapes this material coming from the mountain, and the dust that it creates, and it's almost like a dreamy haze, and all creating this idea of the land itself. And to me, that was very revealing. The a big stone made out of really
Mhm.
heavy materials can become light as dust. So and that could be achieved because of the human labor that happens in between that, how to
Right.
convert that big mountain into a small
Yeah.
piece of glass. So not glass, but like a piece of
Like a
sculpted
cartilage.
material. Yeah, yeah. So there's a piece, in the exhibition, there's an installation called the Feast in the Forest,
Mm-hmm.
and these are the works of the men who work with marble in that island. And I didn't give them any brief at all how to do it. So the sizes are wonky, and the espresso cups are also wonky. But then the things that they experience in the daily life, like a Coca-Cola bottle or like a local snack made out of pastry, it looks very lifelike, and I put it side by side with the rest. So there's that kind of layering that I like, and that I like to do. And since it's about transmuting this material from nature to man,
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to pay tribute to them who works with this material, and allow them to dramatize themselves as the actors within the tableau. So if you could scroll to the
Yeah.
one that is no, the marble, the all of the what do you call that, the
I'm gonna
group
keep going. Oh, the
the
group.
group
Okay, got it, got it. Yeah. I'll just go up. Where the dust never settles, right? That one.
Yes, and these ones that are kind of like paintings. These were the dust coming from the machines that they were
Is
using
this
to cut the
one?
marble. Yeah, so this one, yeah, so this the dust won't settle. These are um, again the fiction part, meaning the deliberate act of making a tableau,
Mm-hmm.
meets documentary because they're actual people who work with marble. So they are dramatizing their own experience of it. So they shape the marble, but also they are being shaped by marble, because when you work with such a heavy material and the physicality of it, right? So they become also the masterpiece, the ones who made the. So it's like an exchange between the material and the human. And also I'm kind of referencing also art history with this kind of tableaus, right? The things that you see in the museums.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah.
I mean, so mountain becomes man and man becomes mountain as well, I guess.
Yeah, they become the sculptures in effect.
The sculptures. No,
Yeah, and
absolutely that.
dust is everywhere. Yeah, the dust is really everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, and my camera after this series was like filled with marble dust.
Right. It became another sculpture of its own, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, which is like this a disaster for electronics, but yeah, yeah,
No.
and I had to come back and forth to the island for about 2 years to finish the project, and it's always by the sea, so
Yeah, I was going to
there's no
talk
way.
about that. Like, I mean, there is that
Yeah.
proximity to the sea that you end up navigating
Mhm.
a lot.
Yeah,
Like,
because this is an island. Like this is like a uh, yeah, isolated island, and the only way to get to it is by the sea. So in a way, I feel like within the 2 years of coming back and forth, it feels like I'm always reenacting this mythological Argonauts, like going through the sea for a big journey to
right.
to have a mission to do something. So it's kind of like that, almost like a very meaningful ritual that I repeated again and again in the making of this project.
Yes. And I mean, are they other readings? Like I know that Joseph Campbell has had a big impact on how you approach the work as well. I mean, and his process of mythology making, had has influenced maybe the way that you think or approach a work as well. And I'm just curious to know, are they other? I mean, do you look at other mediums for inspiration? Are they stimulants in that sense, or is it is it a mix of many things that have not been decoded yet?
Yeah, I think I have I have a library in my head that's just floating, and
Expanding.
they kind of connect to each other when they want to. So the closest analogy I could get is, you know how when Joseph Campbell does his theories about, like, it could be pop culture and then it could connect to something that is ancient
Right.
or prehistoric. So I think we being alive and being humans, it's like all in our capacity to connect these things if we ever spend enough time to kind of allow our imaginations to play with it. And in my sense, it's like it could be like a song I read, a song I listened to, or a line I read, or a conversation, or a movie, or yeah. So it's kind of like it's a jigsaw that I'm also trying to piece together, because once I'm working on something, it's like I didn't even know how I managed to think about that. Sometimes like, okay, I I guess they wanted to come out and say hello. But in terms of the self portraits, it's there's also a part of it that's highly about the intuition and about just, I'm making some drawings, um, or just it starts from a material, like with hunt and gather. I was sitting for a while and I didn't know I was blocked creatively. I had a show date, I had an exhibition date waiting for me, and I didn't have any idea what to do.
Hmm.
I'm not like one of those artists who kind of just follow an obsession and it stays like that for a long stretch of time. Yeah, I kind of just um,
Right.
quickly jump. So I was looking in a on a this little piece of okra,
Okay.
which was in front of me
One
at the
way to
time,
talk to you.
and that's how hunt and gather started.
Right.
Yeah, so this series about the city and also plant life. Yeah.
And hunt and gather is very different in approach and even engagement, let's say, from your other works, because it's almost like a collective action that you were
Exactly.
leading in some ways. And
Exactly. It's very collaborative. This book to me is highly collaborative in nature, and I share the creative process with the bookmaking. This is really bookmaking at its raw form, because that's how I really knew how a book was made. Because Dominion is more private. Dominion was just to talk briefly about the production of Dominion. It's a very thin book, and to some people, it's not a book, but a gathering of pages. But to me, it's a book, and it's more quiet and more private. But the Hunt and Gather was a conscious effort to see what bookmaking is like in the Philippines
right.
in the context of an artist book, because artist books in the Philippines, I'm not entirely convinced that there is a readership for that. And if you don't have that demand, of course, the publishers and the printers would also have a hard time thinking about accepting projects like that. So when I did this project, I had a partner, OCD, the Office of Culture and Design,
Oh,
with Clara
okay. I
or
thought an obsessive compulsive
yeah,
person.
yeah. She's very playful, and underneath that, there's another brand called Hardworking Good Looking. So, they're the co-publishers to Hunt and Gather. So most the design We did a lot of back and forth, but the execution was done by a team of people, like the designer, the graphic designer, Kristen Henson is in New York, Clara Balaguer, the editor, is in Manila, and then another designer is in Sweden, and
Okay.
then one of the illustrators is in Paris, and the rest of the essay writers that were invited to be part of this was
Mhm.
Hispanic from Singapore, the Philippines, Spain. It's like how the terrarium was gathered. You get
Mhm.
the whole premise was to gather the different plants from different places. In that same way, in that same format, the people who collaborated with the bookmaking was also in this sense. So at the end of the day, this book is the 23rd terrarium,
Right.
so it has its own, and it's a very conscious book, meaning the book was aware that it was being made. Because if you see the cover, if you see
Yeah.
the cover, there's like if you could go look at the first, yeah, there is Act One, Act Two, Act Three, so Act Five, this book published. So
Right.
it kind of also chronologically, not chronologically, but it also journals how it was made. The editor's note and Clara's essay inside also describes the reality of publishing in the Philippines. And to publish an offset is almost like the big commitment. Like this is not like photocopying a few copies and then stringing everything by hand, but it has to do with like having plates done offset and have a
Yeah.
short run of 1,500,
Hmm.
because anything more than 1,500 I wouldn't know if there's a readership for that, or buyers for that, or
Right.
distributors for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, because so this is really about bookmaking in as much as it's about plants
And
and the
foraging,
project
which is
and the
like,
project. Yeah, it's a hybrid project, so it couldn't exist without a sort of container to document everything that happened
right.
with it and through it. Yeah.
And I mean, what's interesting is, of course, that the book in itself presents itself as a performance, like you said, with the 5 acts that encompass its
Exactly.
existence. But
Yeah,
it
wow,
also kind of,
notice.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, and then it leads to an agency of performing as well, right? Because the act is also, I mean, it was you working with uh, was it researchers or was it volunteers who went into different parts of Manila to actually bring
The people
land to
who,
you?
who contributed the plants, because the terrarium essentially is made out of ground and then plants and then the glass container.
Right.
So all of it was through an open call I did on Facebook that called for different areas of Manila citizens or anyone who wanted to give any samples of plants or rock or anything. So some of the soil would be coming from a landfill, and then another one would give soil from the golf course. And
Right.
then when you put that together, it just creates immediately a map of the city and the social, like the social political, um, iterations of that, without even saying anything. Just
Mhm.
just the act of putting it together, and the act of making it important enough to be held as precious in like small containers like this.
Mhm.
So there's some weeds and then there's some medicinal plants that grow along pavements. So in the end, these weeds that are forgotten along in the city and in our urban environments, if we start to pay attention, like what the people who contributed said, like, wow, I didn't even notice that there are plants along, along my commute. During my commute, I just have this little bag, and then I put them in there. And
Right.
then back in the studio, I had some volunteers to catalog it, scan it, and
Right.
then the scans we would send them to the University of the Philippines Botanical Department, just to give them, just to identify them. And then
Okay.
sometimes these plants would have uh, properties, medicinal properties, or some of them would reveal that they're not endemic to the Philippines, or this weed that is growing out of the pavement and concrete is actually rice. So, so
Wow.
we, yeah, so there are many revelations
Right.
in the process, and at the same time, I didn't exclude the reality also of concrete. So some people would give me
Yeah.
concrete from a road works, and then that would be like the in the terrarium as well. So a map of the city made out of contributions from people who are living in the city.
And I think
um,
through its biggest witness, soil, which
yeah.
is really really fascinating for me. It's I mean, one of the reasons why I remember before I met you, I kind of knew about this work was because I had an exhibition of my work which also deals with the city forest,
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah,
I'd made these terrariums about which were like my memory holders of my childhood in the forest. And one of
yeah.
the engagements that we did during the exhibition was to call people and have them write or sketch a memory of a forest that they had at any point of time in their life, and it could be from anywhere. And suddenly you realize the different layers of social structures, of
Mhm.
engagement with, of how we choose to engage with nature in cities versus in open fields. All these dynamics play out through memory in such a beautiful way. And for me, that's why these, when I saw the terrariums, it
Mhm.
was almost like capturing the memory of a land, and
Exactly.
it's really beautiful
Exactly.
to see it
Yeah.
in.
And it's so tiny. I mean, because I think on the what happens with art is like we give meaning to that which was forgotten, or like taken for granted. So the terrarium was a device to introduce back to us, like what this could mean for
Right,
us. Because and I'm fascinated that with a project like this, which is very hybrid in itself, could
right.
open further conversations on ecology, on climate change, or on migration, because plants don't discriminate. It's like some plants that are here actually from India. Our need our roads, our main roads, C5 is actually lined with neem trees, and neem
Oh,
is from
okay.
India, and then
Right,
some of it was gifted by countries. So it's like this um, a metaphor for how people have kind of assimilated and migrated, and what is endemic, questioning what is migration, what is all of these ideas about moving and transplanting. So that's what I like about a project like this. It could just hatch and hatch and open avenues to talk about deeper issues, and at the same time introduce something that is light, something that people can identify with, whether you are um, like a critic, or you are just want to appreciate something green in your city.
right, right. Thanks. I know we're hitting a 1 hour mark here, and I just wanted to let. I mean, I'm happy to continue this conversation, and I think we will. But if anyone has any questions or anything that they'd like to say to Wawi, you can actually put it in the chat or in the Q&A section below, and I'll be able to address it to her as well. Um, one of the things I was curious about was that, I mean, this was what was happening in the interim period, right? When, I mean, you started with portraiture and there was a particular language and a particular style that you were following within that, highly influenced, of course, by your readings, understanding, and reactions to the art colleges or art universities that you'd been engaged with previously. And and then there was like okay, I'm going to take a little break from, I can't say portraiture, because I think in so many ways all of this, all of the other works that you've been doing that deal with landscape or ecology, uh, for me they're portraits as well. They're kind of these expanded portraits of your mind in so many ways. And then I know that, was it 2018 or 2019 when you decided to restart the studio in Manila. And I was curious to know, keeping that interim time away, what changes when you head into the studio now?
Yeah. So from 2016, that was when the fire happened.
Mm-hmm.
And also in the same year, I had dengue in an artist residency. So I was not able to walk for a while. And I was able to make a portrait out of it. And I was without a studio and I was just living in a small unit. I found myself traveling and drifting a lot, like from place to place. Uh, Consciously, because I said I could use this to pay rent or I could use this to look and see where I gravitate to. So after doing that for 2 years, I
Mm-hmm.
came back and I said, okay, I need to. I think I'm ready to go back to studio practice, and this is 2018,
Okay.
2 years after, and the resulting images was this tropical gothic, meaning kind of like affirming really where I'm from, which is the Philippines, and my works have become infused with color that has never been seen in my works before. It's like
Yeah.
really hyper, like fauves, really uh, what we could see in the buildings here, or the markets, or yeah, basically kind of really affirming what is around me here. And in fact, it's just, I guess, the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
because the hybridity of the Filipino experience is like so fascinating that I was telling myself, okay, all along, we could go to so many places, and then when we go back to the place where we come from, there's a richer, like you're seeing 5D and 4D, and like, okay, wow, I finally get to work with it. And yeah, so tropical gothic, the hybridity of the Filipino, referencing from my culture and my own experiences, also side by side with um, what I've learned everywhere. So I'm just trying to piece it together as if in this tapestry, and I'm looking forward to how it will happen again, because after this COVID, there's another layer of
Right.
of uncertainty
Sure.
that I'm facing. Yeah, and the more uncertain it gets, the more gothic it becomes. The more gothic it becomes, I just said, if things don't make sense, I just call it gothic. Like it's like the place to figure out the absurd, the place to make sense of what doesn't make sense, or
Right.
hard to figure out. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I guess with each work that you have done, or each experiment that, let's say, you've kind of gone into, your canvas has been expanding as well. I mean, it started with portraiture, led into sculpture, inside, I mean, site specific installations in many cases, books, of course, that we've discussed, uh, but also curatorial projects, and thousandfold, which is a kind of a space that's looking at, again, conversations and engagement with the book form, or even with photography. And I just thought it'd be nice, to talk a little bit about what that engagement has been like in the Philippines, because
Yeah, for offset.
fortunately we guys don't know much of what's happening in the Philippines, and I think it'd be really nice if you can share some stuff.
Yeah, so the Philippines has a lot of photographers, although the photographers are they operate on their own, and of course there's small groups, and then they self-organize and form ad hoc groups or join bigger ones. But in terms of contemporary photography, meaning I would say like things that photography that has been in practice, let's say 70s to now.
Okay.
That was that I was concerned about photography education here because the visual literacy in terms of what we know as photographic only exists like all these classical black and white photographs, Avedon, Irving Penn, maybe Andy Warhol, but
Right.
that's really pushing it. So I remember that in school, the Ann Arbos up until that era. And then that was already 2000 when I was studying. I said, so I guess there's a gap of
Right.
what happened in
In the
between.
middle.
Yeah, and also the question like why are we only looking at works that are coming the from North America or Europe? And the simplest answer is because we don't have books for it, like Southeast
Right.
Asia. From what I know, is like it's always been oral traditions or books that involve text, but not
Yeah.
photographs and images, or they belong to private collections, or they haven't been organized to be disseminated. So all of these things that make the reality that we don't have any access to these books. And when I was studying in Madrid, I was doing my master's for contemporary photography. My my mentors were really the were also practitioners, and they're really at the forefront of photo books. Like my mentors were Martin Parr, and then Simon Roberts, an English photographer, and then Lina Lee, and then all of them would have books. And
Right.
these were fresh, like last year, this year. That and you'd see like a book, and them, it's the creator's work in a book. It's like I could understand how this photographer sees the world by this book, and
Right.
I didn't need to, you know, um,
Fly down for a different course somewhere to get that
exactly.
access.
And it became sort of an obsession that I collected these photo books. Although at the time, of course, I was just a student in Madrid, and what I would do is I would teach English and
Okay.
get paid by the hour. So by the end of it, for 2 hours, I'd have 40 euros, and then that would be
It go
for
and
one book. Yeah. So I had to choose wisely what
yeah.
to what to what to buy, and that during that time also was there's a huge resurgence of photo books in Spain because it was the crisis in Spain 2011, but they're also churning out really like heralding a new age for photo books. Like they were winning Photo, all of these things. They were all
Right.
over and these were the Spanish photographers who I was meeting. So there was
Right.
this direct exchange, and I said, okay, would this be something that would be helpful if I could just bring these books back? And then I would be able to share what is that gap that was missing
Right.
in photography or visual literacy education. You don't need to have lectures, but say, okay, these are the works that are being produced now. And then later on, I would meet or Daniel Butker Smith of
Mhm.
Asia Pacific Photo Book Archive,
Right.
and it was like meeting kindred spirits, and all the way in Australia, or in Singapore, they have also a photo book dedicated library in deck,
Yeah.
and then more and more of
When
this. And festivals would always have a sidecar for photo books. And the way I met you also was
yes,
through. Yeah,
Anchor.
so yeah, so there was kind of like a signpost that said like, yes, we're even bringing the region together because the region has pockets of production, but we don't know how to access it. So if I
Right.
know you and you're with Offset, then this
And
kind of
another
exchange can
conversation.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was the fascination for photo books, and Thousandfold was the platform that I created in 2015 to have that library public, for anyone who wants to access it. And when I still had a space, we hosted the same as you. Like we had like activities that
Mhm.
invite meetups and also critical discussions, slideshow viewings, and a festival, a little
Oh
festival
wow.
for, yeah, for contemporary photography. Yeah,
Oh,
so that was like an ambitious project, but it all was made possible also because the idea was to run it like a coalition of artist-run photographers as well.
right, right. No, I
Yeah,
mean that sounds amazing, and I'm sure it will pick up pace and speed when we're able to see each other, when photographers know.
I think
Uh,
we all have to rethink on how to
yeah,
engage the books, right? As we have discussed earlier, like what are you
absolutely.
gonna do
That's what
with
we've
your
been thinking.
books?
It's this. I mean, it's there. The studio is there, and now we're like, I don't really think we can do workshops here right now for a while. Um, but maybe I mean, we're thinking about alternatives. I mean, this whole idea of having these conversations was one of the many ideas we came up with. We just
Yeah,
have to figure out what else makes sense and what works. And I mean, what's been great is that I think this allows for a varied range of conversations. So we're actually trying to see if we can have conversations based out of works that that are shared among photographic communities and fraternities within the region at least, and and
that's
maybe
a good
we can
idea.
talk
That's a
about
that's a
that.
really good idea because we could just do like this, like look at this.
Yeah. Yeah, or I mean, as terrible as it
Why
sounds, I
not,
know
right?
that for some programs
Yeah.
we even used PDFs, which are very often
Yeah.
extremely,
What I
extremely
find
further
what,
away from the book.
yeah, but it's also another venue, right?
Yeah,
What I find that is interesting is that when we're looking at screens, it's always the scale, the experience of the images, because photographers, we take photographs, pictures, but we present in different ways. Like I just showed
right.
you my work, but if we if nobody bothered to look at the size, it looks like this in the screen,
Yeah.
but the actual size is actually this small.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the missing part that I guess the physicality of the works also has another dimension
Right.
to teach us. But with books also, it's the intimate part of the books that we can carry it with us. Some books are really, really small. MMU from the Philippines, like she makes it, books that are this small, like 1 inch,
Like those matchbox size.
smaller, smaller.
Oh wow.
So it's really, really, really cool. And Dominion, I made it with
That's a pretty
Stefania.
big, right? That's a
Yes,
pretty big
Stefanian.
book.
Um, I work with the publisher, and he should suggested it should be a book that when you open it, it covers your entire face, so
Right.
that it feels like you're in the landscape. So that is a factor also of making photo books and artist books, because every step is a decision, like what size, is it matte, is it glossy, is it folding in this way, is it, yeah, so that to me is pretty fascinating because every decision that was made by the photographer is clear, and the intent is clear in a photo book.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
in some ways, that's what we always end up having a conversation about, even with photographers at Offset, is that you can't look at the book as separate. I mean, you can't say these photographs are in the book. The book is the book, and that's when you start thinking about it like that. Every single element that plays with it has its own narration, has its own attachment to you, and has its own sense of expression. And I mean, now we just have to figure out how to get that across to people who are not able to access it. Um, I mean, hopefully, libraries will still continue in different formats.
yeah, or
Uh,
be more portable, or be more
yeah,
less precious to produce. Like zines are very popular in the Philippines because our mode of production rate offset is like clearly prohibitive. Like when I embarked on my book, it was a clear, like experiment on how the experience was, and I said, okay, this is not something that everybody could do, like in in this way. It has to be really something that is like a project that is for a book. But zines are a faster way to express, and also to contain the images, and then to mail it. If you need to mail it, it doesn't
And
have a
they're also a lot more affordable for people to, I think, purchase. So with books, there's always kind of like this invisible layer about how access becomes restricted, because again, with offset books, and I mean with visual books that do require a certain degree of production, which most of them do have, just access for a lot of people who might really engage with that work in a different way becomes very difficult. And
yeah, yeah,
and that's how this, I mean, the library at offset as well started as well, because I mean we do have a studio, but the library is called a pitara, which is basically a trunk, and that's
yeah,
how we function. We
yeah.
like we just put a whole bunch of books in a trunk, and we throw it in the car, throw it on a train, and
That's
take it
great.
wherever
That's
we can take it. So hopefully there will be an expansion of that in the coming time. Zines are definitely big in India now. And in fact, there are a bunch of collaborative projects that we're working on with the zine format offset. It's just that then COVID happened and made me were like, is this the best time to be printing stuff out?
we need to see that here.
Yeah.
So,
We will
so
we will have another chat on this soon because we want to see some of the work from Philippines here
yeah,
too.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think
I'm
that should
excited.
happen soon.
I'm excited, but it's like in our shelf, the shelf that we have is like, okay, this is the collection from everywhere, and the Filipino section is only this,
Right.
because also, yeah, and then but then we encourage each other, like, this is how much we need to fill, like the
Right.
shelf to fill, so everybody's invited to produce um, a lot. But then when you think about this end product, you also think about, wait, do you have enough work that is, that is
Yeah.
that is publishable, or that is ready to be made into a zine or a book? So this, when you step back, you're thinking, okay, now we have to introduce classes for editing. We need to do mentorships, we need to do workshops for this to happen, because before the book, there's a lot of things, there
Other
should be a
process.
project. Yeah, the book doesn't just happen just because you throw in random things there. Yeah, unless that's the statement, but ideally it should be like the voice of the maker. But before you get through that, then you have to have a project or a story or
Something to
something.
say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we have Katrin, I know, in our attendees over here. You remember Katrin as well? I don't know, from Anchor, yes. And so when you
Hello.
said we need to talk about like education and editing, and like she's the
Uh,
first person who always comes to my mind, because I
yeah,
know the
it's wonderful.
way that she kind of works with students is to just say, like, believe in yourself. I think the entire workshop is just to help them kind of find faith in
Mhm.
who they are, and then they figure out what they want to say, and and then that journey begins.
That's the hardest. There's a lot of heartbreak involved in finally realizing, what projects that are going to be killed before you arrive at the project that you're going to stick with. Yeah, but
Hmm.
experimentation is really important, especially if you're starting to learn photography or the visual culture in a larger sense. And then Catherine, I was lucky enough to visit PSC in Melbourne,
All
where she
right.
is with Daniel. um, and I was invited to do a small portfolio review, and I was able to talk to the students, and they were all, the good thing that they're doing there is that it's all about them exploring their own projects, which is with the guidance of the mentors, or with the guidance of their teachers like Catherine. They would have the program to to really hone it.
Hmm.
Yeah, because if you're outside of the school, that could also happen, but you have to DIY a lot of things. You
Right.
know, with 100 YouTube videos, maybe only
Yeah.
five of them
And
really
yeah,
helps
and then
you.
you go right to the end. You're like, okay, this did not tell me what I needed to
They
know.
set you up with a workshop with somebody you really admire, or you go to a festival and there's something there. So yeah, it could happen like autodidact, like, like teach yourself. But there's different modalities of learning nowadays, just a matter of
Yeah.
what works
For
for
what?
the person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And I think there's constant learning and constant growing, and I'm really excited to see what comes up as the next surprise from you. I know there's one surprise baking baking
Yeah,
in there, and
yeah, full of surprises, and everybody is. I guess right now everybody's like cooking things, how to work with what we're trying to face during this time. Yeah.
yeah, no, but
So
thank you so much
update
for
me
this.
what happens, what happens to Offset and what happens in India. I hope to visit one day, and you
I'm
too,
I'm sure we're gonna figure out a way to do that.
and those listening also. Hopefully, we all could travel again soon, and in the meantime, we
In
still
the
have the
meantime, we
camera.
have this. We have virtual screens to
Yeah,
at least give us one static frame that we can keep changing within. You know,
and who knows? It could be an experiment, right?
yeah, we can definitely think about that. But thank you so much for joining in today. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your thought process and everything that we spoke about with the book form. Um, and I hope many more performances in many more mediums are up ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be able to talk to you like this stream from Delhi to Manila,
Yeah.
and also to reach out to new people to see what we have in the Philippines. I mean, you could start with my work and then jump to other things. Like everyone else, I'm on Instagram and Facebook, so just yeah, follow the rabbit.
Follow the rabbit. We've got for those of you who's still here, and I know, I mean, many of you have had to run, but I've put in Bavi's website on the chat, and also there's a link for each of her books in case you guys would like to go ahead. And I think Art Books is the place from is kind of like a resource where you can also purchase the books and
Yeah,
get
we ship internationally, and if you just want to browse and see what's on offer from the Philippines, it's a really good um, independent bookstore in Manila.
okay,
And if
that's
you
amazing.
come here, you should visit the
Yes.
actual bookstore.
Definitely. I'm gonna call you from the airport and be like, let's see each other there. you know. Uh, Thank you everyone for joining in. We are going to have the last of these sessions actually. This is the last week of intensive programming that we've been doing at Offset. It's a month of many conversations that I'm gonna treasure for a while to come. And
Congratulations.
thank you, thank you. And on Sunday, we're actually going to be talking about archives, and we're going to be in conversation with Divas Raja, Alicia Set, and Shafat Farooq. Divas works with the Nepal Picture Library actually, and has. I
Love,
remember I mentioned them to you once about Kathmandu when we were trying to see
very,
what
I
can happen.
very admire their work.
And
Yeah.
so Divas is actually one of the curators of two projects, I guess, two conversations that have emerged from the archive. One, which is the Dalit history in Nepal, and the second is the feminist memory project. And we're going to be just he's going to be in conversation with Alicia and Shafat, who are actually working on um, an archive of images, family images, and otherwise in Kashmir. And I think, I mean, what's interesting is to talk about the different dynamics, the ethics, and concerns that they have in working with their own projects, but also in talking about what that means for this current rush of works that's coming through the archive, and ethics and ideologies that haven't really been kind of picked upon and poked at up
And
until
how
now.
to just basically manage an archive and decide what to
Absolutely.
makes it out and what makes it, into the archive. I'm going to tune into that for sure, and
Thank you.
I'll share it. I'll
I'll
share it.
send you I'll send you a link. But see you guys
Yeah,
on Sunday.
yeah.
Thank
See
you
you,
everyone.
and yeah,
Talk,
stay safe.
stay indoors.
Wear a mask.
Okay, yes, we definitely will do. Thank you and good night.
Good night.